on this computer, just so you know, and we're just waiting for everybody to log in.
Okay. Looks like we got a pretty good turnout. Good morning, everybody, for all of you that are here.
Yeah, they are all, I explained to them, I'll explain to you, Larry, I had everybody, you know, when you set up the Zoom, I had it set up so that everyone's muted upon entry, so they can't all say hello right away, but I did ask them if they're able to show their video so you can see who you are presenting to.
Yeah, well, thank you. Well, I know it's always interesting on these Zoom meetings because sometimes if it's, you know,
All the black screens, yeah.
Yeah, I made some like just have my name on there, you know, but I knew I had to be on visual today, so.
I appreciate that. Yep. So everybody has been saying hello. Larry, are you planning on using any breakout rooms this session or no?
No, not this session.
Okay.
No, this will just be pretty much everybody here, and we're just going to have a chat, and I'm going to share the key information, and we're going to give you opportunities to ask questions.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I just thought this would be a real informal, let's just get to know this process. And so Bernadette, will you monitor the chat questions that come in?
I believe Kate and Don will be monitoring for you, and I'll help out in any way as well. Let me ask you, Larry, though, do you have on your toolbar the green button that says share screen?
I surely do.
Okay, good. So that's what you would use to share your presentation.
Right. So when you tell me to go, I'll just share the screen and.
Okay, no problem. We'll just hang in there and wait a few more minutes. I know it's 8:57 now. We have 28 people and counting. I believe last I checked, we were at 102. Let's see.
Wow, that's a really good turnout, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's pretty good. Well, I'm in Colorado, so I'm calling you 2 hours behind New York time.
Oh, wow. I forgot that you were in Colorado. Sorry.
Oh, yeah, no worries. So yeah, it's actually finally starting to, I think it's going to try to stick with being spring.
Okay.
I don't know if any of you have been to Colorado very much, but oh my gosh. I lived in California for 35 years, and my wife and I moved to Colorado 2 years ago, and we love it, but yeah, the weather is totally unpredictable. One of the things we have a garden which we were trying to get planted, and everybody said, "Oh no, don't plant your garden until after Mother's Day because you never know what's going to happen with the weather." So anyway,
New York is kind of like that too, Larry.
It's
a little overcast by me over here on the island. So funny, we live on Long Island, but it could be different in different spots.
It really is. Okay, well, should I share the screen now, and then we'll just get ready, or would you like me to wait?
Kate, what would you like to do? We have 41 people and counting, and it's 8:58.
Oh, we got 2 minutes still.
Yeah, we have 2 minutes.
Yeah, I'd say we wait a couple minutes.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, it's so nice to see all of you. Hope you're all doing well. Crazy times, right?
Very crazy times.
Yeah, I know. It's really tough. And we're always thinking about the kids and how they're all doing and so on. And it's just, yeah, I hope, everybody always talks about this as our new reality. And we hope it's not our new reality, our permanent reality, but, we're certainly doing all of our best to pull together and do everything we can for everyone. So I hope it's all been, none of your family or friends have been affected too immediately or directly by this. But we will triumph, right? As we always do.
You see some hands going up, Larry?
Yeah. Right.
I see you, Ann. So yeah, Larry, we're in New York. In our region, I think I might have mentioned this to you, I'll just remind you, but our BOCES, we are the second largest BOCES in New York State with 51 districts. And then, but on Long Island, we have 125 districts total.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Yeah, so I guess while we're waiting, I'll just share with you a couple things. So I've been working with BOCES all over New York. It's been really exciting. And this presentation, I started giving a first virtual presentation back in February to the St. Lawrence Lewis BOCES. And we knew it was going to be a challenge to get everybody together. And this is before everything really hit. But what we organized first was I just gave a 1-hour introductory overview first for their regional superintendents. And then there was a follow-up about a week later for an hour with the secondary principals, which was then followed a few days later with the elementary principals. And then I presented, our plan was to do the work, you know, for them to do the work on site, and I would advise them through the process virtually. And so we were going to do ELA and math, prioritizing. And so they had identified ELA volunteers, teacher leaders who would lead the ELA work, K-12. And then we also had math, same things, volunteers, math leaders who were going to lead the work of prioritizing throughout the BOCES K-12. And so I was doing 5 one-hour webinars that were all the same. It was just introductory to give each audience the overview. And then we got to the 6th one, which was scheduled for, this won't surprise you, March 20, and we had to cancel. And that was when, you know, the word went out and the schools were being closed, and they had to think about, you know, how they were going to respond and take care of everyone. So that's been the overview of this. But you know, then more recently I've done the Southern Westchester BOCES, kind of the same thing, just a 1-hour overview. We're going to go a little longer today. We're going to go 90 minutes, which I think will be more beneficial because I've added and refined and included some additional information that I think will be useful to you. So yeah, it's real exciting. I mean, we can do the learning virtually, and hopefully we can at some point get the teams together. I've been working recently with the Arizona Department of Education, and we've been using Zoom and having representatives from all over the state log into breakout rooms virtually, and they've been looking at Arizona has new English language proficiency standards that are being rolled out. So it's been pretty exciting to realize that a lot of this work, which I thought was going to just come to a screeching halt, we've been able to do virtually in these breakout rooms, and it's working really well. So anyway, that's just my little intro, time fill, while we get ready to start here. But I thought you might like a little bit of a context of what I've been working with.
Thank you, Larry. I think it's really good to have everyone here where you've been working, you know, knowing that you've been working in New York State, you know, and you're more familiar with our standards is helpful as well. And knowing that, of course, you're working, you know, in various states, you know, across our country, just as a testament, I think, to your experience. So thank you for sharing.
Oh, well, thank you, Kate. Yeah, more recently, and then I'll wrap up and we'll move in. But so I did the prioritizing of the standards of the New York standards before the next generation came out in Genesee Valley. And I'm actually, they're bringing me back in August. And it's really funny because we have 2 plans, one for an on-site and the other one for a virtual presentation. But you know, the next generation standards, you know, I think, you know, it's really an important process that we still look at prioritizing. So hopefully you'll all get some value out of this today. Okay, well, I think, I guess host is going to have to enable my screen sharing.
We get started, Bernadette? What do you
Oh
think?
yeah, when you see the green button, it doesn't allow you to do it?
No, it says that the host has disabled my participants since I'm a participant.
Oh, I apologize. Okay, let's see.
That's all right. It happens all the time when we do this.
And Don's going to give an introduction of Larry. So I don't know if you want that before you share or after.
Oh, either way, whatever works. I'm real informal, everybody, so whatever works.
Okay, so Bernadette, why don't we wait for Don to do the introduction? You can still share, and then Larry, before you allow that.
Sure.
Okay, sounds
All right.
good.
Yeah, let's get started. So good morning, everybody. I'm Don Murphy from Hauppauge School District, and I'll be moderating this Zoom with Kate Gavin from BOCES. I do want to thank Kate and Bernadette for putting this together. We're all juggling a million different goals here, and at the top of the list is how to end this year properly, and then how to prepare for next year. So they've positioned this well. They've created this think tank, and we have at the start 5 sessions, today being the first. We'll have close to 100 people on this call, and Kate and I will help moderate it. And we ask you that you just keep your microphones muted and utilize the chat. There'll be definitely time to ask questions. I'm going to introduce our esteemed guest, Dr. Ainsworth. And I'm going to read just a brief bio about him so you have a sense of what today's about. So Dr. Ainsworth is the author or co-author of numerous books, including Getting Started with Rigorous Curriculum Design. And he's currently an independent education author and consultant, served as the executive director of PD at the Leadership and Learning Center in Colorado, Inglewood, Colorado. He's done a number of keynote addresses and breakout sessions across North America and beyond. And he works on site in school systems, although now virtually, I would say,
Virtually.
to assist leaders and educators prioritizing and unwrapping state standards, developing common formative assessments, designing authentic performance tasks, and creating.
Hi, good morning. I have a window.
Okay.
Please mute when you can, Maria. And creating rigorous curricular units of study in all content areas. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Ainsworth. Larry, if that's okay, right?
Absolutely.
Normal. And thank you so much for joining us. There's a lot of familiar faces on this call from across Long Island. They may not be familiar to you yet, but we're all definitely united in trying to mobilize around this important work. So thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Don. And thanks everybody and welcome. And I'd like to thank especially Bernadette and Kate also and all of you. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen. Whoa, looks like we're ready to go. So thanks, Don. And so everyone, I just, as I said, welcome. And we'll get right into this because I know your time is really valuable and precious. And I've put a lot of thought into this presentation today because not only are we, thinking about prioritizing the next gen learning standards, but what's obviously the new twist is the fact we want to see how this can be done through distance learning. So as I've been thinking about this day and putting this together so that it would be helpful for everyone, again, here's my contact information. I want to invite you all, please, at any time to contact me by email. You can visit my website and find out more information about the priority standards process. But again, the main thing is just to know that I'm here to support all of you in whatever way I can. So please don't hesitate to reach out if I can respond to any specific questions that we may not get to today during the call. So I wanted to give you a little overview. This is how I've organized this for today. I want to give you a brief rationale for prioritizing the New York State P12 on next gen learning standards. And then also to look at primarily the established criteria, what we typically use when we do this work on site, the process steps that we go through, and what I think is really the most important piece is how to vertically align the standards from pre-K all the way up through high school. So this is pretty much, I wanted to start off by giving you the essentials from the presentation as it's worked so successfully now for really pretty much almost 20 years I've been doing this work. Used to call it power standards back in the early 2000s, and then we realized that people saw that kind of as a buzzword, like they thought really what it meant was you just select certain ones and eliminate the others. And I said, no, can't do that. So I wanted to rebrand it, calling this priority standards to really convey the idea that there are other standards that we have to consider and we can't just eliminate. So I wanted to start off, as I said, to give you the overview of the essentials because I still think it's important that we look at the whole process and then move from there and see how we can adapt that into distance learning. So that's our focus. Obviously, we've got a chat function. Hopefully one of our facilitators will monitor any questions you may want to submit as I go through it. I'll stop probably about halfway through. And again, if you're not ready today to chat, that's fine. There should be plenty of information for you, but I wanted to at least make that opportunity an invitation to you. And then there's a possible discussion. We're talking about how we could do this work virtually. So, but again, I thought the most important part was just to begin with pretty much the essential information about this. So you see this quote. This is when we were, I was mentioning how I'd started this work virtually in the St. Lawrence Lewis BOCES. And they were really wanting to set the tone or frame the discussion around this. How do we develop our expertise and support this work? And since so often the BOCES are the central provider of professional learning, and district members will then come forward, this work is something that it works best collaboratively. And often people, they'll want to do this work in their own districts. Others want to do it regionally. And the process then is really important. They learn it so that they can use it in whatever way works best for them. The key is teacher involvement. Teachers need to be at the heart of the decision-making of this work. And I'll show you this as we go through the various aspects of what I planned for this morning. So just really quickly, to start off with, you'll notice I've got priority standards bolded, and the other standards not designated as priority, I refer to them as supporting standards. And they have a vital role to play in kids learning the more rigorous priorities. So one of the first things, just to let you know, is I did write the update. I wrote the first book, Power Standards, in 2003, but then I updated it for the Common Core, obviously, in 2010. When those were being rapidly adopted by all the states, New York included, of course. And in 2013, I wanted to really go deep about how to really identify specific Common Core standards in ELA and math. And you'll notice the ones to emphasize the most, not that we're eliminating the others. So even though we've in many ways moved on beyond Common Core, the ideas, the principles of how we do this, the process is still solid and as relevant now as it ever was. And this one doesn't work on only ELA and math, it works in all content areas. So just to start off, here's the definition that I used as an excerpt from that book. I'll give you a moment to read that, but the key word there is subset. Now again, remember, we're talking about in normal circumstances that we've been used to historically, where kids are in school, the teachers have the full year, or most of the year until state testing, of course, to really make sure kids have learned these standards before they move on to the next grade. Well, then the other idea that people seem to really spark to is this idea that these priorities should represent assured student competencies. In other words, really, how are we going to know for sure that the kids have mastered it? If that word is too strong, I like to use the phrase providing credible evidence of learning, that they've really met those priority standards. They are assured student competencies. So those are the idea about the priority standards, more coming on that, but I just wanted to give you an intro overview. What about the supporting standards? So as you can see, these are the standards that support, connect to, or enhance the priorities. The key distinction is they don't receive the same degree of instruction and assessment emphasis. Often they are lower level skills, which are really necessary for kids to learn en route to the more rigorous priorities. So some people like the idea of thinking of them as instructional scaffolds. And whatever concept or construct works for you, the relationship between the two is really important. I want to illustrate that by showing you this one example. Years ago, I was working in San Diego Unified School District, a huge district, probably comparable to the number of, the size of your BOCES in terms of schools and so on. But one of the things that they really like this idea that for a unit of study, for example, if this was one of those priority standards in bold, notice the verb analyze. It's a rigorous standard, multiple accounts of the same event, noting similarities and differences, point of view. Well, then they were saying, but what would be the standards that would help kids get to that? So they were looking for related standards that they would teach at the same time, but that wouldn't receive the same degree of emphasis. And a lot of times if you look at the verbs, look at the verbs, determine the meaning of general academic words, explain how an author uses reason and evidence, those are necessary building blocks. So the relationship between the priorities and supportings are really important. I just love this visual because it shows those supportings indented to make that relationship clear that these are the ones that we're working in tandem with to achieve those priorities. Just one quick example, here was one from math. So 6th grade math about ratio and rate reasoning, real world problems. This is quite an in-depth complex standard. And obviously we can't right out of the gate just teach that in isolation. The other standards that help kids en route to building up to this, these ones you see about understanding the concept of ratio, the concept of unit rate. Again, teachers of mathematics, of which I was one for many, many years, we would obviously look at the hierarchical nature of, we need to teach this first, this second, this third, and so on, to eventually get the kids to the more rigorous priorities. So this wouldn't be obviously the only standard in a unit or the only supporting standards. I just wanted to illustrate this relationship by indenting those supporting standards. Okay, so really briefly again, the why. I mean, this has always been a big issue for people. I think a lot of people don't need convincing. They know that there are just so many standards that they do need to prioritize. But I like to just start off really briefly with some of Robert Marzano's data. It's been around for a while. I used it in the Common Core book, but also I still think it shows and it still has current relevancy. He talked about time and viability. So you see with this quote, and I took the liberty of bolding and italicizing adequately addressed. What does that mean, adequately? And also instructional time available. So the adequately means we can't just teach it once and then the kids got it. You know, we have to teach, reteach, reassess, reteach, and so on. But we want to make sure there's enough time to do that for a guaranteed and viable curriculum. Well, he did the research, and his studies at that time, and again, obviously this was pre-Common Core, but it's still, I think it shows a lot of truth and it resonates with people. He did the simple math. The typical school day would be 5.6 instructional hours, a typical school year, 180 days. You do the math, it's 1,008 hours. Now, of course, that's no interruptions. That's teachers being able to teach bell to bell, but that's another issue. And then he multiplied it with 13 years just from kindergarten, not pre-K, but just K through 12. And there was the math, 13,104 total hours. Well, he looked at standards and benchmarks across national, state level documents, and then he asked teachers for the reality check. How long do you think it would take for you to really teach all these adequately? So look at the disconnect. The teachers were saying, no, 2,500, almost 2,500 hours more are going to be needed if we really want to make sure that the kids have learned them. So Marzano had a wonderful little quip summary. He said, to cover all this, you'd have to change schooling from K-12 to K-22. And the idea about the sheer number of standards, the voluminous number of standards, is the biggest impediment. So, you know, just as a little bit of a frame from his research, but when I was looking, you know, I presented this information 2 years ago. I was invited to present statewide at a conference at Union College in Schenectady about prioritizing because the next generation standards had come out. And so I was putting together a presentation that included, you know, 4 content areas, not just ELA and math. But I wanted to show you a little bit of the difference. I'll move, I don't know if you can see that. I'm going to move this. I want to make sure you can see the numbers. But this is what happened. One of the significant change in ELA that New York did was they looked at the informational text standards and also the literature standards. And they realized there was a lot of redundancy or repetition, I should say. Not that that was wrong, but if you look at what we did, or what New York did, was they basically combined those. So it was essentially the same skills, but it would be applicable to both literature and informational text. And this dramatically reduced the numbers from what we originally had, but you can still see that there's still quite a few. One example of that was, I just thought I'd pull this up for you, was an 8th grade reading standard. So you'll notice in literary text and informational text, but then the standard is essentially the same. There was just a combination. That's how they were able to reduce the total number. One of the things I wanted to point out that I thought has been really important about why prioritizing is the level of rigor. So originally, a couple of my colleagues had looked at the informational text standards in 11th and 12th grade, and they were just using the 6 levels of Bloom, and they were looking for the verbs that matched up with each level. Well, they didn't find any at the level 1, remember, but they found a few at understand. And then when we went on to the apply, there weren't any in apply. Oh, sorry, my timer's going off here. But look what happens when we get up to level 4, analyze. Look at how many verbs, how many skills were included in the Common Core standards. And then when we went to evaluate, even more. So we did the, and then create, obviously, was what kids would do in performance tasks. But we did the percentage calculation. If you look at it, 72% of the skills listed in those Common Core 11th to 12th grade informational texts were at rigorous levels, higher levels of rigor. We did the same thing with DOK. We looked at the depth of knowledge on their 4 levels. And again, you can see that matching up the skills with those different levels, the preponderance of those skills were at the higher levels. So I think, again, the mathematics of that was to something like 67%. Oh, I got to move this over. So there it is, 64%. So anyway, again, this was just rationale about why I do this. Really briefly, when we look at math, this was always one of my favorites. Look at how much is in this one standard. So the idea was that in mathematics, this looks like almost like a super standard. There are multiple standards that really would need to be in this. And so what New York did was they actually added to the numbers when they created the next gen standards, which makes people think like, oh my gosh, more standards. Really all that was done was made them more usable for teachers and kids by taking those more paragraph length ones, like the ones I just showed you, and splitting them up so there wasn't so much into one standard. But again, the rigor is still there. The other issue that comes up a lot were the math practices. And the idea is that these are basically the math habits of mind. But the idea is we don't prioritize these. These are all designed or intended to be emphasized continually. So again, that's just a short little overview of the rigor and also the numbers to drive home the point that if we have this many standards, we need to think closely about this. Are all of them equally important for kids to learn in order to be ready for the next level of learning? Well, most teachers, if you ask them right out of the gate, they'll say, no, they're not equally important. They're important. We don't want to eliminate. But the idea is that we realize there is some weighting, W-E-I-G-H-T-E-I-N-G going on. And then the other question, of course, is really the zinger is, does the school year provide enough time before state testing for kids to adequately, for the teachers, I should say, to adequately teach, assess, reteach, and reassess? So the idea is if the answer to either of these questions is no, what's the option? Prioritizing. And teachers are doing that anyway. I was a classroom teacher for 24 years. And I knew that often there were just too many standards. I did my own prioritizing, but I was using my own criteria, like what I liked, what I was good at, what I had materials for. We need some consistent criteria that all teachers can use, and that's what you'll see coming up. But I wanted to at least, kind of wrap this up about showing that really prioritization makes sense from a practical point of view, and yet we have to be very mindful of the fact that we're not eliminating standards. Real briefly, this idea about depth and breadth is most would agree that if we can focus on fewer standards for the goal of achieving depth of understanding, not coverage. Well, prioritizing is what makes that possible. And I know that teachers often feel like they're overwhelmed. They feel like they are running on this standards treadmill, trying to get everything in, especially if they're using curriculum programs that really march all of the standards and all the curriculum with a pretty tight pacing calendar. So this is normal situations or historically, familiar school realities that we've dealt with. So the idea about balancing depth and breadth, if you can take fewer standards and really go deep, and spend less time on the ones that would support and help kids get that, they're going to retain that learning longer than they would when we're just zooming through all of them and trying to get through. Some people often worry that we're eliminating certain standards in favor of others. And again, just to reiterate, this is probably the message I've had to say over and over, almost to the point, I should probably get a t-shirt that we pass out when we do these workshops. We're not eliminating, we're prioritizing. And the two work together, as I was showing you in those illustrations earlier. So anyway, I'm not going to go into the science standards today or the social studies standards, but I did address this in BOCES that have been asking about this. I thought this might be useful just to see when people have said, well, what is it we prioritize? Because often there's so many elements, you know, the math practices, for example, and so on. Well, what is it we prioritize? ELA, pre-K-12, the grade level standards in each strand. So obviously right now during this learning time, people are really focusing on reading and writing for the most part, I believe. But the other stands, language, speaking, and listening. But we look at those grade level standards, not the anchor standards, the ones that are specific to the grades. In math, pre-K-8, we really want to look at those standards in each domain, geometry, data probability, and so on. That's what we prioritize. But in high school courses, we go by the course level standards for algebra, geometry, algebra 2, and so on. Well, then what about science? Well, it's interesting because everyone's pretty much agreed that the science standards are pretty tight and that they don't necessarily need to be prioritized. But what we do want to make sure happens is that those performance expectations are vertically aligned. In social studies, we're looking at the standards. We prioritize those because there are a lot. We also have practices. So the question is, should we, I don't know if you can see the question mark, there are also social studies practices, and there's a lot of those. So the question would be, well, would we just do the standards, or might we also consider prioritizing the practices? And then also we've got, for both science and social studies, pre-K-12, we've got literacy skills that they've got to consider. So there's a lot that needs to be thought through as we go through this. And again, I just wanted to give you this kind of an overview to kind of see about where we lock in and what we really focus on, because that is always the question. Well, Larry, what do we prioritize? There's so many elements, and this is what we've used to kind of clarify that. So now the next question is, how do we do this? Who does the work? How do we prioritize? So I want to start off by showing you the established criteria that we've used for literally almost 2 decades that work really well. The one, again, I'm moving this, forgive me if you see me moving this around, I'm just not sure if I'm covering up any of the visuals. The one that we always talk about is readiness for the next level. The idea being, rather than just on our own prioritizing, when we get groups of teachers together, they're asking for an objective set of criteria. And the ones that we found historically that have worked are this making sure that if kids can learn this standard, will they be prepared to take on that more complex version of the standard in the next level of learning. So that's one of the criteria. The next one being endurance, life skills. Is this something that's going to last over time? The next one being leverage, which we talk about as interdisciplinary connections. If kids can read a table, chart, and graph in one content area, can they transfer that skill to another? If they can read a passage, an informational text passage in, for example, in science, could they also understand how to transfer that skill and be able to identify the point of view or the main idea in social studies or any other content area? And then the last one, it used to start off with these 3, but then we all know that with the accountability of state testing across the nation, it's been such a dominant factor that we had to include external exams. So what is it that kids are going to need probably to be prepared for? Performance on Regents exam, New York State assessments, and so on. So that's a factor. And sometimes it's become the overwhelming or dominant factor, but I've always said, let's keep it in perspective. It's about student learning. So often what we'll do is we'll ask teachers to do and focus on these first. Use your professional judgment, look at the standards, find the ones that meet those concepts that you see here, and those would be your priorities. We give them, ranges of how many to do and so on. But then also, we want to not neglect this. At some point, we need to also look and see what the state is suggesting would be areas to emphasize the most instructionally. And also, we look at some of the trends. One of the BOCES that I work with was kind enough to share this with me for today. If you like it, I can find out if I have permission to share it. I think I do, but I would always want to check. They were looking first at ELA, and they were looking at the trends. So I want to go to a new share up here real quick and show you this because they have it in an Excel spreadsheet. Can you all see that? Yeah, thank you. Notice what they did. They looked at the Regents exam first, and look how they started tracking it in June of 14 with the standards on the left. And they looked at how many items for standard number 1 all the way up through January of 19. And then they did the same thing for the other standards. Again, I can't see it, so I'm going to just move a little bit. Look what they found. See those total for all the years. So standards 2, 3, 4, 5, those were ones that were more heavily represented on the Regents exams. Well, at the bottom, you can see like they did the same thing for 8th grade, 7th grade, 6th grade, 5th grade, and all the way down to 3rd grade, because they really wanted to get a good sense of, as I said, they wanted to get a good sense of which ones would be probably emphasized the most is identified by the trends over time. And then that would be the factor that teachers would look at. But I always want teachers to first use those 3 criteria and their own professional decision-making to come up with the ones they think would be most critical for the kids to know and be able to do, and then be able to look at state testing for kind of a confirmation or see if there's something else that maybe they didn't consider that they need to. And then that way they can feel really confident as they move into the work of using those priority standards as the representation of all 4 of those criteria. I did put this link. I don't have a similar chart like that for math, but I was sent this link that you could see at the bottom and realize it's probably a lot for you to, if you want to take a picture of it, or I can just share this slide with you later if you'd like. But this gives guidance about which standards in mathematics have been emphasized the most. So anyway, I just wanted to bring that in because that is part of the process. I want to check, does anybody have a chat question yet? If not, I'll go a little bit further and then I'll give you a definite chance to ask some questions. I realize it's a lot of info right out of the gate, but I want to just start off.
No questions yet, Larry. Nothing on the chat yet.
Okay, Don, thanks. So everybody, this is probably the all-time favorite slide. I want to show you this one. People love this idea. When they're thinking about the criteria, sorry I keep moving it. I don't know if you can see it or not, but they like the metaphor of a fence with the idea that the priority standards are the posts, they anchor the fence, and the supporting standards are like the rails. They connect the posts and support the fence. And without both, you have a pile of lumber. So people will often be saying questions like this. They're looking at 2 standards that are fairly similar, and they'll say, well, wait a second, is that a post or is that a rail? But the one I always give guidance for is you want the one that's more comprehensive, the one that's more rigorous, the end game, not the ones that's more foundational. In years past, before Common Core, when I was working and doing this process across the country, teachers would always look for those, what they thought were the more basic foundational standards. That they, well, all the kids need to know these before they move on. But that's no longer the way. Now we have to look at the more rigorous ones because that represents where we've got to get kids. The expectation is under normal circumstances or past regular circumstances, where we need them to be before the year is up. Because the next year is going to be expecting kids to come in with those as prerequisites. So we can't stay at the foundational level. We've got to make sure we're moving kids toward the rigor. And this, again, I think is part of the rationale of why we need priority standards. We need to really pinpoint what those are and then really work and do all we can to help kids achieve them. So the other thing about the post and the rail, as I mentioned earlier, was this idea about thinking of the supporting standards as the fence posts, as the fence rails, those scaffolds to help students attain the more rigorous priorities. So often what people will do, then I like to give a little example. We obviously don't have too much time here this morning, but I want to show you how this kind of plays out. So if teachers are looking at 2 standards, often I'll put these up on screen. I'll say, all right, everybody, let's just practice a little bit. I'm going to show you 2 standards. Which one do you think is the post? Which one is the rail? So it has nothing to do with which one shows up, although it's going to kind of be a giveaway, I think, on this one, but maybe not. So look at this informational text one. Give you a moment to take all that in. Now look at the breadth of that. They want this done in historical, scientific, technical text, relationships, interactions. And then if you compare that or contrast that with, even though the verbs only explain, that would still require understanding. What about this one? Quote accurately from a text. When explaining what the text says explicitly. Let's stop there for a minute. Well, to me, most people say, oh, that's a slam dunk. It's clearly the first one because it's more rigorous, it's broader, and it's got multiple applications. But then as people have pointed and said, well, quoting accurately is good, but it's not that kind of important. It doesn't share that same degree of importance. But then people are always quick to point out the last part of the second one, when drawing inferences from the text. So obviously that's a higher level skill. And again, that's what shows why it isn't that all the supporting standards are just low level skills, but what we need to do is look at the relationship between the ones that we think are the broader, more rigorous priorities and the ones that can help kids get there. Well, certainly inferencing is part of that ability to explain relationships. So I just wanted to kind of give you a little bit of a warm up to see how people are actually using that post-rail concept. This is much more straightforward. I've got some other math ones which would challenge us a little more than this one, but how about this one for kindergarten geometry? Identifying and describing shapes, and then ultimately for kids to be able to analyze, compare, create, and compose shapes. So obviously people would say that the second one is the priority, but obviously kids, they can't do that if they haven't been able to do those first ones I indicated in that first standard. So again, just a little bit of an idea, but it's been really helpful. Teachers will often be looking at those post and rail. So what I try to keep on screen when they're actually doing the work is this. These are the ones that are tried and true. The ones that we've just discussed. And so they may ask themselves, or they will be asking themselves and each other, okay, well, does it meet readiness? Check. Does it meet endurance? Does it meet leverage? And then the ones that do are the ones, sometimes they're clearly obvious. Other times they're not sure, or teachers might be split. Some people see like certain ones, well, this is really part of this one. So what I always say is, get the ones that hit you on a gut level. The ones you know the kids have got to get this. And then the ones that you're not sure of, just put a question mark, because the process isn't over. We're just starting to reach an initial consensus. So anyway, how's that for a lot of information in 35 minutes? I knew this would be a lot to get you started, but I wanted to give you that overview and rationale so that as we move into the next part, which is really going to be, how do we do this in a moment anyway, with regard to distance learning. So I just wanted to just check in and see if everybody's okay so far. Don, anything yet?
Yeah, we do have one question, Larry. The question is, when looking at the spreadsheet that you presented of read exams, were the most asked standards the post or priority standards in your analysis?
That's really great. So what this BOCES did was they simply did a lineup or a matchup with the questions on Regents and the standards, all the standards. They just matched them up to say like, okay, well, look at how many questions there are that relate to this standard only. So because I know this BOCES has been doing this work for a long time, I believe that what they would have done is they would have then looked at their existing set of priority standards to see if they matched one-to-one. And then if they didn't for some reason, they say, gosh, you know what? We've been emphasizing a lot standard 6, for example, but there really aren't that many questions on it. Or we didn't realize that standard 2 was being so many questions related to standard 2. We didn't prioritize that. Maybe we should go back and look at it. See, one of the things, everybody, that's really important, and I'll mention later, is that these are never set in permanent stone. The idea is that we want teachers to be actively involved in making the selections, and then what we want them to do is to review at least annually the existing set to say, all right, let's look at our test data, And also we've had a year of teaching these. Does everything still work, or do we need to make a few revisions or tweaks? So that keeps the process alive and very relevant. So hopefully that answers your question, but that's how they use that trend data to just look at the existing set of priorities and to see if they needed to make any switch ups. And for districts or regions, BOCES that have not yet done their priorities, they want to have that kind of information so that after they've made their initial selections, they can get what they call a reality check. Just to see like, okay, well, let's make sure that the ones we've selected are the ones that are probably going to be most heavily emphasized on state tests. Okay? All right, everybody, well, I'll give you a chance to do a little bit more. One last thing I haven't mentioned yet, which is really important, and I'm going to be using this for the remainder of our time to frame the discussion. So on-site learning, which is the way we've always done this, even though I've given these webinars, basically they've been the overview, as I mentioned, kind of what we're doing now. So people get a sense of doing the work, but they've always then done the work virtually. I'm sorry, they've done the work in person. Well, now it's a whole new ballgame, as we know. And so my thought was, can this work continue virtually? So we're going to get to that in a moment, but let me show you typically how we do the steps once teachers have had this overview. So we have them seated in grade spans that you see on screen. And the idea is what they're going to do is they're going to basically assign themselves or assemble in grade bands. And then they're going to be looking at the vertical alignment. They're going to make those initial selections, which I'll show you in a moment. But a key step and the power of them working collaboratively and vertically in grade bands initially, I'll show you how it ends up P12 in a minute, but is the fact that they want to make sure that whatever they select in one grade is going to prepare kids for success at the next grade. And the idea is that when we're done, we often begin vertically prioritizing from grade pre-K to K, K to 1, 1 to 2. And that same process is going on at a separate table in 3, 4, and 5, and a separate table in 6, 8, and a separate table in 9, 12. But then eventually we want to get a P12 vertical prioritization so that we've got that vertical flow and we can ideally, have kids graduate prepared for college and career readiness. So the steps so that we go through, and I wanted to share these with you, is when the teams are seated in grade bands, they'll start with one grade, they'll look at one strand in ELA, one domain in mathematics, and then they'll say, okay, let's look at the criteria. I have them on screen. Oh, I'm showing this, right? Everybody can see it still? Yep, okay, good, thank you. So they'll use those initial selections and they reach an initial consensus. So the room's quiet, the tables are quiet, they're all individually reading the standards in that strand for that one grade level at a time. They mark the ones individually they think are the priorities, then they talk it over with each other and they try to reach an initial consensus. And if they have any disagreements, the power is in the discussion, because often teachers will say, oh, I hadn't thought about it that way. Yeah, you're right. Okay, you persuaded me. I think it should be the priority. Well, once they get that grade done, then they'll move to the next grade. If we've got a lot of people involved, we've often had a K table, a first grade table, a second grade table, a third grade table, and on up. But typically, we don't always have the bandwidth to get everybody together. I remember once I presented this workshop in Tully, New York, and we had a full day. The whole district was there. All the teachers were there, and we had them sorted by content area: ELA, math, science, social studies. But because all the teachers were there, we had enough to have individual grade level teams. But usually, as they said, it's grade bands. So if they finish kindergarten, then they look at first grade. When they get done with the first grade selections, they look at second grade. And meanwhile, that's happening at the other grade band tables around the room. Okay, next thing is they put their selections on chart paper and we post them on the wall from pre-K or K, depending on where you start, all the way up through high school in sequence. And then this is where it really is exciting. We have a vertical discussion. So the pre-K or K2 team, they get up They show the whole group, everybody's looking, they say, this is what we selected. This was our process. We had a couple questions. And then what they'll do when they're finished is, if they have done them, they'll present their first grade chart and then their second grade chart. If there have been individual tables, the K team will present, and then we'll turn to the first grade teachers and say, first grade teachers, if the kids came into first grade with these well in hand, would you be happy? Would that give a good solid foundation for you then to teach your standards? And so they'll usually nod their heads or they'll have some comments. Usually there's a real easy agreement. When teachers do the grade band configuration, that's really powerful because they're looking at, for example, pre-K, and then they're looking at K, and they've already been looking at pre-K, so now they kind of know what to think about for K. Then they look at 1, then they look at 2. Well, again, I'm only using that first grade band to describe this, but this is going on simultaneously with the other 3 grade bands. It's so powerful. So once they get that vertical agreement within the grade band, then we start looking vertically across the grade bands. So everybody, it just depends how you do this. Sometimes it's all done within the grade bands, and then we share it out with the whole group. And then we've got 3, 5, 6, 8, 9, 12 can weigh in and see what they're thinking. When 3, 5 gets their turn, they present what they selected, 3, 4, 5. But it's always this question: if kids left each of these grade levels with these priorities well in hand, and you had assessment evidence, would they be prepared to enter the next grade level and take on that grade level's standards? And so that's why that conversation is so powerful. And then some of the times what we're doing is we're looking for, I'll explain in a minute, we're looking for some of the gaps or the overlaps that may occur, and I'll tell you about that in a second. But here's the rest of the process. So anyway, once we've got an initial selection of these vertically aligned priority standards, because typically not everybody's there. All teachers usually, because of bandwidth, subs and things like that, we can't get everybody together. That one district, when I told you in Tully, it was a full day PD, so everybody was there. But usually what we do is we'll send those initial drafts out to the staff. Those who didn't take part in the initial selections, they get a chance to hear about what priorities are and review the drafts, provide some feedback, and then we bring that feedback. Then we bring the feedback back to the committee. The committee starts looking for connections to state assessments, and then we might send those out again if we have any revisions for everybody to see. But then what you want to do eventually is revise, do any revisions, publish them, distribute them, and let everybody know that we're going to review them every year to make sure that they're still viable. So it's really powerful. But as I said, you can see it involves a lot of people because we want the teachers to all feel like they've got a voice and ownership. Just a really quick story. I was doing this work in West Haven, Connecticut, and we couldn't get everybody released to do the work. So we had a central committee with reps from each building. They came together. We did those steps 1 through 3. And then the assistant superintendent, Dr. Drew Zalowski, she had, we were offering informational sessions where teachers could come and hear about it after hours, after school was over. And then the comments were from teachers, oh, now I understand what this is all about. They got a chance to have like a mini experience, and then they were in better position to review the drafts, and they felt like they were all working together and they were grateful to their colleagues for doing all the work. So again, I'm just trying to broaden the idea about it's just not a chart where you just boom, 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 follow these steps. It really is a powerful, powerful process, because then the teachers feel like we've all got our own individual instructional responsibility, but we've vertically aligned this so we have like our pre-K or our K-12 roadmap. It's great. Here's a little bit more about that vertical alignment. I mentioned about posting the charts, comparing the selections. I didn't say much about this, so this is important. Often when they see the standards side by side, they'll realize, wow, this was a focus in this grade, and then the next grade, and the next grade, and all of a sudden it drops off. Wait, what happened to it? Where was it in the next grade? It doesn't pick up again until the grade after. Well, that's a gap. So obviously they want to go back at that grade and look at how they might want to change one of their selections to make sure there's no break in the flow. But now here's the flip side. The other problem sometimes happen is a certain standard or two or three or four are identified as priorities again and again and again and again and again. And at some point, the middle school and high school teachers are saying, wait a second, if you just keep adding more and more and more, I've got to do all mine plus these. At some point, the teachers decide that certain priorities that were multiple grades, they turn into supporting standards in the higher grades so that the teachers can then go deep with the ones they know that they need to hit. Does that make sense? I hope, everybody. Omissions are simply, we've seen this. I was working, as I mentioned earlier, I've been working in Arizona, and we found that there were a couple standards where they were English language proficiency standards, but they were introduced in some of the lower grades, and then they were not again, they didn't even show up again for almost 3 or 4 more grades. So what would be the natural thing? The teacher was saying, oh, I guess I don't have to worry about those. Those are done. Well, what the committee did then is we made sure that we were closing those gaps, or that we were providing the guidance that said, keep these being used while you put your focus somewhere else. So in other words, it wasn't just like they're over and done. That's what's so powerful about this, is that relationship, priorities can turn into supporting standards to be maintained. I mentioned that a lot of times when we're doing a lot of different strands together or different domains, teachers get the hang of it after the first time through it, and they'll start vertically aligning, as I mentioned earlier, within the grade bands. And then sometimes what we'll need to do is just connect the grade bands. So from grade 2 to grade 3, grade 5 to grade 6, grade 6, 5 to 6, yeah, that's right. And then from grade 8 to grade 9. And then by then, though, they're very confident that the vertical alignment within the grade spans will enable them just to look for them, make sure those connections are maintained between the grade spans. And then lastly, we talk about learning progressions. You know, the ELA standards and the math standards are very carefully vertically aligned. Those standards from each grade serve as prerequisites or learning progressions for the next level of learning. So we want to make sure that when we do the vertical alignment of the priorities, we're not breaking the learning progressions. So that's why this is such a thoughtful process, but everybody feels so energized by it because they realize, okay, now we've got the whole picture. I can see what I need to really focus on, and we've taken into consideration all these things to ensure that we're remaining faithful, staying true to the intent and the wording of these carefully constructed standards that were all vertically spiraled in ELA and hierarchical structure in math. And then lastly, as I mentioned, if we find there's a gap or something we need to change, then we'll go ahead and we'll make those changes in that vertical flow to make sure that vertical flow is maintained. Okay, well, there was a lot of information. I thought, at least I had to break it up a little bit because I know, this is normally what we do over the course of a couple hours, and where people aren't having to kind of race so much through it, but we're in a compressed situation here. So hopefully that gave you the overview.
Larry, we do have a few questions. Can we pause
Yeah,
for a
let's
second?
stop. Okay.
So Ann Palmer said, love this. Have you done work with helping teachers identify the evidence of learning for a particular priority standard or the evidence for reaching the foundational standard?
Yes, absolutely. And so everybody, one of the things to point out, and again, this is all about what I call the first foundational step of building an integrated teaching and learning system. We have to have a really strong foundation of these standards. And then obviously what these will do is these will then inform the design of formative and summative assessments at the unit level in the classroom. It will inform instructional planning because teachers will realize, wow, if those are the priorities for this unit, I've got to make sure that I'm assessing at the same level of rigor as these priorities are, and that I'm basically I'm ensuring that I'm designing my instruction so kids are going to be able to achieve those priorities by the end. So really, this is just the foundational step, but it's sort of like the standards foundation first, really get the identification of the priorities, put them into units of study, and then my next practice that I've been really presenting for almost 2 decades as well is unwrap those standards, really deconstruct or unpack those priorities to pinpoint what the kids need to know, what the kids need to be able to do, and identify the levels of rigor, DOK and Bloom. If they do that first, then they can make sure that when they're creating their assessments, they're matched to the level of rigor of the assessment. So in other words, for example, if the skill were analyze, well, what kind of an assessment question do we need? We need an analysis question, not a recall or an interpret. Teachers have loved this because they go like, oh my gosh, I never really thought about making sure that my assessments directly match the level of rigor of the standards. Otherwise, you've got ships passing in the night, you know, where teachers are thinking, oh, we're doing really well, but they might be asking lower level recall questions or lower level skills rather than making sure they're getting that evidence that kids have met the standard through assessment, formative and summative. Okay?
Thanks, Larry.
Larry, Maria Meyer shared a comment that I'll connect to a question. She added that she's starting to plan for reentry and running a committee focused on instruction. Prioritizing is going to be critical, especially that we do not know what school will look like. So how should we think of this work in relation to an uncertain September, particularly if we're distance learning and the number of minutes and hours we have in that construct?
Right. Well, thank you so much. And that's a perfect segue into what's coming up, which is my next. I wanted to hear, Kate and I talked about this on Friday, as have Bernadette and I. And the idea is there's a way to use this process, which I'm going to share with you in just a moment, in distance learning. But we thought it was really important that we not neglect the fact that ultimately or eventually, we would still want to have a comprehensive set of priority standards across each of the strands in ELA, across each of the domains in mathematics, that we looked at the vertical progression of the performance expectations in science and so on. Does that make sense? So I wanted to kind of give you the whole view about ultimately how this should be done and then make specific modifications or adaptations for the distance learning environment. So I think you said Maria, Don?
Yes.
Yeah, so everybody, if you can just hang on for one more slide, I'm going to get right into that. But I wanted to make sure you all felt comfortable or understanding how the whole process was really developed when we didn't have these limitations imposed on us today. Okay? So the idea is this is the last slide before we go right into respond to Maria, and I'm sure the rest of you have been wanting to wait for this too. The vertical teacher conversations take the guesswork out of what students need to know and be able to do next year. I remember often I would say to my students, all right, boys and girls or ladies and gentlemen, next year you're going to need to know this and this. Well, are we sure? How do we know that? So one of the things that I'm going to be sharing with you is this idea about how to do a little bit of this checking at the next level yourself to make sure that what we're going to focus on during these weeks out of school will help prepare kids for the next level of learning, because we know all the loss that's happened instructionally over all these weeks. What are we going to do about this? So I'll give a little more clarity about that in just a couple of seconds. But again, the benefit of the vertical conversations is all teachers know what their instructional responsibilities are, because we've looked at the whole trajectory. Then I want to talk a little bit about horizontal alignment. That just means like within the grade. So within 7th grade or 4th grade or whatever, we've got our priority standards, our related supporting standards, and we've assigned them to units of study. So we make sure that we've got everything accounted for. And then in the horizontal throughout the year, we've got those units of study that will prepare kids for success in the following year, because those vertical discussions helped us know what the priorities should be for each grade, and the supporting standards are going to help the kids get there. And then now I can work within my grade level to make sure horizontally that the kids achieve that and they're prepared. Now that's the ideal, and that's what we try to do. So now let's go into distance learning. So this whole idea about the fact, and we've seen this go on, is that we are determined that learning will continue, not only for the kids primarily, but also for the adults in the system. So the question that I wanted to frame, I thought what I'd do is just kind of do my own little Q&A for you. teachers are wanting to know, well, what kind of criteria, we know that that was the in-person process, but now in distance learning, what kind of criteria should we be thinking about during this time? Should it be all 4 of them when the state, gave us waivers on the state testing? What? So again, just to show you, I think this is a reality to say, we can't do it all, even during a full school year, let alone under these current circumstances. By doing it all, meaning, obviously if we have priority and supporting standards and it's all orchestrated, it's still going to be a struggle. But the idea is that with these limitations that we're facing, it's even more important that we start looking at the criteria and what can we do. So acknowledging the fact that we have very limited time online with kids, we've got to really get a sharp focus on essential standards, priority standards that will prepare kids for the next level of learning, especially for the fact that we've lost all these weeks of school. Now, I know for a fact that teachers worry. As a teacher myself, I used to worry if I was even out of school for a day, to either because I was sick or if I was going to a workshop. And I would worry about the time that might be lost in terms of kids learning. Will my substitute accomplish all the lesson plans? Will I have to go back and teach? Teachers care so much about our kids that we worry about what's going to happen. Will kids lose a day? Well, this is unprecedented. The time lost is out of our control. So the question now should be encouraging about what can we do? What can we do to control, what can we control, I should say, to help close kids' major learning gaps and prepare them as best we can for the next level of learning? So when I thought about that, I was thinking about, well, what about the next level of learning? What would be those expected prerequisites that we would strive to achieve in the current grade before the kids moved on? So when I was looking at the criteria, remember this I showed you earlier, would you select all of these now for the distance learning? Would all of these be the ones that you would expect a standard that you wanted to focus on to meet? Or might we only want to take a couple of them? Well, I'd like to propose this idea. Which one to me would be the most important? That I feel like my main concern would be, it would be this one, readiness for the next level of learning. What can I do about prioritizing those selection criteria further to come up with ones that I think would be really critical? So that would mean I look at my current grade, my current course standards, and if I can find the ones that I know that would be really critical after missing weeks of school, then I would think that that would be really the critical piece to look at. So here's kind of how I framed that a little bit further. So what could we do about that vertical alignment? Well, you know what? If we haven't had the discussion, if we don't have priority standards, if we've really never had a vertical discussion, I know I did this for years. I just assumed I knew what kids would need for the next year, right? So I would start off and say, all right, well, kids, I know we're going to need to do this next year, but without the benefit of collaboration, I think it's important that we let teachers know we are confident in their ability to rely on their individual professional judgment. Select the ones that you think would be really critical. One way to do this might be, so to look at a third quarter instructional focus or a fourth quarter instructional focus when we're not in school. And it's almost the idea, if I had been in school right now, I know I would have been teaching this, or I would have been teaching that. Well, look at those planned units that you would have been doing, whether it's third or fourth quarter, and then select an instructional topic that you would focus on, and then identify one or two prioritized standards specific to that instructional focus. In other words, we can't do it all. And you might say, well, we don't have priority standards. Well, you know what then? Use your professional judgment and pick one or two that you think are really critical that would match that focus of what you would have been teaching had you been in school to the end of the school year. So no, basically the idea is that we're just trying to really, really scale it down. Because with the limited time we have, with all kids not having equal access to technology, distance learning, and so on. We've got to make this doable. We don't want to water things down. We don't want to just abandon and not do anything. So had I been in school, I would have taught this unit. If I had taught this unit, I might have done 5 or 6 standards, but you know what? I've only got time to maybe do a couple. Which 2 I think would give kids the most leverage? And then I might want to look at the standards above my grade to see if those are going to be emphasized the following year in the grade level above. Now, again, you could say, well, we don't know because we don't have priorities, but I think it would still be helpful. That's one great thing about the way the standards in New York are organized. They spiral in ELA. We could look and see what the next level of standard that match look like. In math, we could see like what would be the expectation in the following year. And that would just kind of give some support for teachers knowing, yep, I can just take a couple standards in this unit that I was going to teach anyway, and know that if I can do that well within these limitations, kids will be served well to move when school does resume. Now, the other thing I want to go on to is I want to show you kind of like what I would call is when using that one prioritized criterion, it's not enough to make all the decisions that we need, right? So I was thinking that even though we would work on looking at that next level and trying to make sure there was a matchup or an alignment with one standard or 2 even, but I was thinking like, let's go to this question. How about the doable practicality? All right, so let's say I pick a couple of these. How do I use them, particularly during distance learning? So my idea was it's not enough just to make all these tough decisions about where to focus. So I want to just present for your professional consideration an idea of a practical way to do it. So first of all, I'd start off like this. Okay, so I'm an elementary teacher. I teach multiple subjects. I'm going to pick one. I'm going to just learn this idea with this one content area. Let's say I'm going to do math. Okay, so I will pick the unit that I was scheduled to teach, and one that I know it's important for kids to learn. I would identify 1 to 2 standards that match. And again, it says choose from the priorities if you have them. If you don't, use your professional judgment. This happened in Waterloo, New York one time. I was working with some high school history teachers. They didn't have priority standards. And so they said, well, I don't know how to pick them. I said, well, tell me what unit you're going to teach next. Well, one gentleman said, I'm going to teach a unit on Islam. So I said, okay, open your standards. Tell me which standards that you know you would normally teach. And he immediately said, this one, this one, this one. I said, which ones do you think are really critical? He had no trouble whatsoever picking out the ones he knew. That was based on his professional judgment, and he did not have standards. I want teachers to feel like, to trust themselves. Pick a topic, pick a couple standards. If you have priorities, great, select from them. If not, use your judgment. Next, just take a moment and look up at the next grade or course to see if you can find those same standards and see what's required there. And then that will confirm or reconfirm the importance of what you're selecting and also vertical alignment. Because remember, we've got this chasm of where we left off this school year before kids resume school in the fall in the next year. So all we can do is a bit of what we wish we could have done had we all still been in school. Now, then what? And this might also go into the question we talked earlier about how do you get some evidence that the kids have learned it? So first thing, keep in mind that the priority standards are the more rigorous ones, and they're going to require some prerequisite learning from simple to complex. So if you've got, like, for example, 1 rigorous priority standards, then what I would suggest you do is think, what would be the building blocks or the learning progressions I would need to teach the students first on their way? And a way to determine what those building blocks would be look at your current grade supporting standards. Or if you don't have them, look at the other standards and say, well, you know what, when I taught this one priority, this one would be a little easier as an entry level or one that I would want to teach at the same time. Then those could serve as prerequisites to help kids get to that more rigorous. Because, for example, let's say you picked summarize. All right, kids, good morning, hope you're doing well. I want you to read this story and your assignment is to summarize it. Well, what if kids have never had any skills leading up to how to do that? So teachers would need to know that the goal is for kids to summarize, but they first have to teach them, you've got to read the passage, underline keywords, we've got to figure out what the main idea, look for some supporting details, and build them up so they could actually give that summary. I hope this is making sense, everybody. I'm just trying to kind of present an overview about how to do this on a much smaller scale when we don't have benefit of collaboration, and yet still feel confident that we're moving kids forward and preparing them as best we can for the next level of learning. And then now where does it go from there? Lastly, we could do this. You can plan a very short unit of study with your related instruction, because now you're clear about what your learning targets are. Plan a couple learning activities so kids will get it. And then you want to find out if they're learning. So what about this? Create a short, quick progress check that kids will, accomplish as a formative check that will give you credible evidence of whether or not they learned it. Again, the idea is to scale this way down. A lot of times I'll say to teachers, everybody think about it, if you taught a lesson during this class period at school and you wanted to check for understanding, then what about an exit slip? Something really short, matched to what you focused on, that class, that lesson, that would just allow you to look through and see if kids were getting it, so that you could do what? Interpret student responses to identify learning gaps. Are the kids getting it? Oh, I need to go back and reteach. The last step would be use those results to adjust instruction the next instructional day as needed or session. So I kind of wanted to show you a little mini version of what happens after prioritizing, by these few little steps, these little 10 steps that I think make sense that teachers would go, yeah, that's what I could do. That's doable for me. I could pick a topic I was going to teach. I could find a standard that was rigorous, that matched. I could then look and see if there was a matchup with the next grade level. And then I could think about building blocks. For me to be able to make sure kids get this, what would I need to teach them first or second? And then look at those supporting standards to help me do that. Plan my little instructional unit or lesson, and then whatever I'm going to have them do as a learning activity. And then I'll give them a quick check for understanding that I'll use to see if kids got it. I'll interpret those. I'll see if there's any gaps or whether we can just move on. And then if I need to make adjustments in instruction, I will. So to me, here's how it all works. And this is just good practice, I think. We teach, we assess, we interpret, adjust. We teach, assess, interpret, adjust. So that's a little way to do those things in a much more scaled down, time compressed way. And because here's our goal, would you agree? That's what we want. That's our goal, is to try to get kids to be successful. So anyway, that was just my offering and suggestion. I only have basically just 2 more real quick slides to go over, and then I'll at least you open it up for the remainder of time for any questions or clarifications. One of them has been, how do we hold students accountable for meeting all grade level expectations if we only prioritize a few standards? Well, again, under normal circumstances, we're going to have that assessment evidence of the priorities. But in the distance learning situation right now, as I interpreted this question to be, with all these limitations, nobody can hold the kids accountable for meeting all of them. So what can we do, though? If we remember that those priorities are never taught in isolation, that they're always, they receive the greatest emphasis, but those supporting standards provide that, the scaffold of those prerequisites, those learning progressions. If we'll do that, then the idea is during distance learning, we can identify and teach priority standards and related standards within short units of study. And again, that's the only idea. If we go with the idea that there's no way we can hold kids accountable or ourselves accountable for meeting all of them, what about holding ourselves accountable for a couple of them or a few of them? And again, this way we're hitting a couple priority standards, a couple supporting standards. That way we're at least doing what we can do and gathering assessment evidence around those few, and being a realistic, setting a realistic goal and accomplishing it within these time constraints. I guess the bottom line is this: when we all agree that depth of focus by targeting a few standards is a lot better than superficial coverage of many, I've seen a lot of teachers that I've talked with, parents across the country, and they've said, well, we're just going to really blast through everything and make sure, because we're not going to get the kids back. They're going to the next level. So we're going to just expose them to everything. But is that going to really work? It's really funny. In Indiana, I work with a large school district out in Indianapolis, actually. And they had a really funny expression. This idea about the superficial coverage, you know what they called it? They called it spray and pray, which is the idea, like, spray the kids with all the standards and pray it sticks. You know, I said, well, you know, you can do that, but then what's that? Is that going to really help them? Wouldn't it be better to go deep and really get them proficient in it? Spray and pray is not going to work. So as we've all found out, even under regular circumstances. Okay, last question, last slide. What are strategies for prioritizing curriculum? One of the BOCES in New York asked me about prioritizing curriculum, and I said, well, first of all, remember that the standards are always the focal point, and the curriculum is what teachers use to help the kids achieve the standards, not the other way around. The standards are the driver. The curriculum is the vehicle to get there. So referring those priority standards, you could look at the curriculum. Teachers will look at their teacher edition or their curricular program, and they'll think about which aspects of that curriculum should receive the greatest emphasis. Those could become then your curriculum priorities. That's what I love about the priorities. I've had teachers say, well, we've got a curriculum, how do we put the two together? My thought is, take your priorities and overlay them on the scope and sequence of the curriculum. And wherever those priorities show up, then you could even highlight those in your scope and sequence. That's where I've got to go deep. And then they're going to provide really good activities and suggestions to help you achieve those priorities. And then the idea is, so which parts of the curriculum can serve as supports? And lastly, whatever activities that are suggested, those will help you focus and provide students to achieve the priorities. And then all the ones that don't, those time-consuming ones, just de-emphasize those. But again, I think this is just sound teaching, a way for us to plan, but the whole idea is scale it down, small steps, baby steps, with fewer standards to focus on. And I think that's going to really do our part within these challenging times to prepare kids as best we can for their return to school. Okay, so everybody, that was a lot. The last thing I just had was your questions in our remaining minutes. I just wanted to give you a chance to ask anything that, and give you a little bit of chance also to consider, you know, what you think about these ideas, and give you a little chance even possibly to think about, well, what benefit do you see in doing this? Maybe you get a few moments of reflection even for yourself, like, okay, what can I take from this that is relevant and applicable to my situation that I think made sense to me? I just want to give you a little bit of time to either ask questions or kind of work, you know, just quietly yourself before we just start to wrap up. So however you'd like to do, I'll take some questions, but the rest of you, if you want to just kind of tune out for a minute and just do some thoughts about any of these ideas that you feel were relevant for your situation, please, I want you to do so.
So Larry, we do have a few questions we didn't get to before. Do you want to pause or do you want to address
No, that's fine. I mean, I'm hoping that people that just would rather reflect instead of hear anything else right now.
Okay.
They could even, you know, just kind of turn off the sound for a minute and do that reflection. But no, I'm mainly here to answer any questions that may have come up, please.
Okay, so from Lori Canetti, she had asked, you know, curious of the time frame for completing the process. Now, this is before you got into the further refinement.
Uh-huh.
How long did it take to complete the districts you worked with?
Oh, okay. Okay, I understand. Thank you.
When you're doing the full
right.
steps for the priority standards.
So everybody, that's a great question. So the idea is typically this, and this is again proven over and over and over again. When groups come together, whether it's one content area or multiple content areas, everyone hears essentially what you heard in the first part of this presentation. I give what I call the keynote part. I give the overview, the introduction, the rationale, the process, and then what we'll do usually by late morning of that first day is they will get into their grade level groups. They'll start working through the process for one strand in ELA, for example, one domain in mathematics. They usually make those initial selections by the noon hour, by lunch. When we come back from lunch, I introduce the vertical alignment step, give them things to talk about and consider. Usually before lunch, they've created their charts. They've posted them on the wall in a pre-K-12 sequence. And knowing that when we come back from lunch, we're going to do the vertical alignment discussions live, in person. So right after lunch, then we'll get back together and we'll get the information introduced, and they'll start sharing out by grade band their selections. We confirm up and down the grades. We move all the way through grade 12. Now, here's the good news that will encourage all of you. This process can be completed in 1 day of on-site learning. So I'm thinking with lunch, with breaks, it's about 6 hours, right? Now, people will say like, well, wow, that's pretty great. I mean, 1 day to do all of this? I said, no, here's the caveat. You're gonna leave understanding the rationale, the process, you will have a first-person experience of it, and you will leave with one strand of ELA, one domain of math, prioritized and vertically aligned by the end of the day. And then guess what? They go, now you know the process. So guess what? Now what you need to do is find the time, arrange the time to come back together again to do the other strands in ELA and the other domains in mathematics. But the cool part about it, everybody, is usually when I've done prioritizing, I'm there no longer than 1 full day. Sometimes I'll come back a second day if that's what's requested. But I feel really good usually after 1 day because people go, okay, I get it. And they're usually really excited because they're like going, we want to get the rest of them done. Remember once I was in Ohio working with a large group, and they went through the first strand or domain in ELA in math, and before they were even, the whole group had caught up, they were already on to the next strand or domain. And I said, wow, you're already done? He said, hey, we're Ohio, we get things done. People are usually really motivated because they understand the process. They want to get the rest of them done so they have a complete set of all of them. But that's typically the time frame, okay? I hope that answers. So that's been done in an on-site situation. So now, can this be done vertically? The answer is yes, it can. And I learned this recently in my work in Arizona, where we had people using Zoom and going into breakout rooms and following this process, but it requires obviously some adjustments and modifications. Okay, what was the next question, Kate?
I'll take it.
Oh, okay.
Quick question and then a follow-up. So Ann Palmer's asking if you'll be sharing your PowerPoint. The protocol is so great.
Yeah, we can talk about doing that. Usually, I don't, because it's my own intellectual property. I don't usually share the full PowerPoint, but I can certainly provide. I want to help and support all of you. So if it's useful, perhaps I could give you a PDF version. Would that be satisfactory? So people could at least refer to it as opposed to the actual slide deck. But no, yeah, I'll certainly talk to Kate and Bernadette about this because, as I said, the whole idea now is we want to make sure that you're hearing this work. If you wanted to go back into your own districts and do some of this work, you would like to have some guidance. I understand that. So hopefully that would, give you that guidance that you could do.
That would be great. Thank you, Larry.
Sure.
Okay, let's see. Next question. So Glenn Cochran, who is a science consultant for us, shared that the New York science standards are in the infant stage. Do you have suggestions for prioritizing, particular to science standards?
I have a whole section of slides that I presented when I was in Schenectady at Union College, specific to science. Again, I mentioned it really briefly earlier, but the performance expectations, most people in science across the country have agreed, if they're using the next generation science standards, that they're already prioritized. But the idea they're not necessarily vertical aligned I mean, they may be vertically aligned, but a lot of people want to make sure that that vertical alignment is intentional. So often what they will do is they will, you know, rather than looking at the assessment of, I think it's boundaries and the cross-cutting concepts and so on, they just want to make sure that that vertical alignment begins in the primary grades with those performance expectations and is moved and progressed vertically appropriately all the way up through high school. So I'll be happy to have another conversation with you about, you know, about this offline, but you know, right now that's basically about all I have to offer, is just to kind of give you a kind of a quick thought on what, because it's been really interesting. The science teachers will often be sitting together. I remember we had this in Genesee Valley, and they were, okay, well, how's this going to work for us? And the same thing happened when I was in upstate Michigan. You know, the science teachers were all waiting to hear, like, how would they be able to do this work? And they found that having a vertical alignment discussion was very powerful.
Larry, so just piggybacking there, so talking about science and of course, in your presentation, ELA, math, social studies you referenced. What is your sense of, if we are distance learning, how we should think about not just prioritizing standards, but other disciplines like the arts and electives and, you know, business and tech ed and so forth?
Right. Well, you know, that's a really great question. I'm very happy to say this to all of you. From my own experience, is this process absolutely works in every single content area. Prequel, I will remember for a couple of years I was working in Connecticut with their technical high schools. At the time, I'm not sure if they still have 17, but there were 17 technical high schools, and they were all looking at the competencies for their respective areas. So they were prioritizing in cosmetology, did I say? Cosmetology, sorry. In CAD drafting and automotive and culinary arts. They felt it was still a very relevant topic. And when I mentioned that one district earlier in Indiana, Wayne Township, Indiana, we started off with, you know, most people start with ELA and math and science because why? Those are the tested areas typically. But then everybody else says, well, what about us? I mean, we've got a lot of standards, or we want to get that clarity. We want to have the vertical alignment. A lot of times the standards are not set up that way. And we feel that this would be a really powerful conversation for us to have. So what they'll do is get together and they'll look at whatever their standards are, their competency. We've done this in the arts. Most recently, 2 months ago, I was in San Diego Unified and I was working with all their VAPA teachers, visual and performing arts, and also their career and technical education teachers. And they were all finding this to be a completely relevant topic, because those conversations about the specificity of what kids need to know and be able to do in each grade level and each course is really something to really make sure they've got a consistent understanding from which they can build then their units of study, do the unwrapping, the learning progressions, learning targets, success criteria, formative, summative assessments, performance tasks, all of it. Everything builds on the foundation of these priority and supporting standards. So yeah, all I can say right now is, as an encouragement, that yes, we can do this. Just so again, I don't want to, I could go on because I more recently a district, I'm working in a large district in Georgia, and we had all of their career and technical ed people there, and they're all doing the same work, as are the other content areas and visual performing arts as well. So, but I didn't know how many more questions there were, and I'm watching the time. I want to make sure I don't keep all of you longer than you were planning.
So let's see. You know, we have some comments that I'll just share with you.
Great.
So Jacqueline O'Hagan, reflection, the importance of focusing on standards for depth of understanding, not coverage of content, real life relevance for students and deeper learning. You know, many takeaways. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm so glad, everybody. You know, that was, you know, I really want to say that New York has really been on the forefront of states that are really realizing the need to have priority standards. And this has been around, as I said, for a long time, but the frequency of requests or inquiries I'm getting through my website about prioritizing, has been highest in the New York BOCES. And I think it's just right, because how do you build an integrated teaching and learning system when you've got the standards that, you know, may not have been prioritized? You're trying to build a huge superstructure on a very shaky or thin foundation. Prioritizing is critical, and having teachers at the table to make those decisions is really critical. I will share with you, there have been times in other states I would not mention where large districts or states have said, well, the teachers are so busy, we should do all the prioritizing for them. And then we'll just hand it out and they'll be really grateful. And you know what has been the result of the response? The teachers have said, what is this? They don't understand what it is, how it was put together, how it was supposed to be used, and they had no voice, no ownership in the process. So that's why through the BOCES in New York, having districts or, you know, the entire region come together to do this work has been really powerful, because the teachers are the drivers of this whole work. So that's why I just can't say enough about the fact that it's always been powerful, and I'm now seeing, especially with my work in Arizona, that it can be done virtually with the same degree of effectiveness, so that people feel like they've got a full set from which we can pull those ones that we could do through distance learning during these very unusual times that we're in.
Just real quick, Glenn had asked for an email for Larry. I posted that in the chat because Larry had put that on his first slide. It's Larry at.
Yeah, actually, it's right here again. I'll put it back up so you can see it.
Yeah. I actually had a typo, so I'm going to fix that myself.
Yeah, I've learned what happens with a typo.
Yes.
So thank you for correcting it. Yeah, I was gonna put that one back up, everybody. So yeah, well, any other comments or questions? One of the things Kate and Burnett and I've discussed about the possibility of, and we'll have to see, but basically what your response would be is, if there's any interest in all of you to possibly attempt to organize and do this virtually. You know, I just think there is that sense of urgency we all feel like right now, but I wanted to make today's webinar with hopefully some very helpful and specific things that individuals could do to capitalize and try to do what they could to prepare kids for the next level of learning, without benefit necessarily of collaboration or a preset of vertically aligned priority standards. So hopefully those ideas, some of them were useful or helpful for you as you think about that next step.
Yeah, and I did want to comment, Larry, that we are looking into having Larry back towards the end of June, possibly into July, doing some of this priority standards work through a distance learning module, you know, similar to what we've done here today. So when we get that information together, we will be sure to send that out to all of you.
Okay, everybody. So anyway, we're all back together again. I see you all. So I hope that was helpful, everyone. And if there were any, as I said, other questions, a lot of times people will say, like, you know, there was a lot to think about. I have to process this. So that's why I want to just open up the invitation to you down the road. If you think this is something that, you know, you have specific questions about or so on, please, again, don't hesitate to contact me. So anything else? Bernadette, Kate, Don?
I just want to thank you so much for being here with us today, Larry. We really appreciate the time. You know, Larry graciously donated his time to us today, to all of our region, to really help provide this foundational information. So we really, really appreciate your time. Thank you, Larry.
You're very welcome, Bernadette. Thank you, Don. And also Kate. Kate asked me if I'm going to be, actually, I believe, Kate, I'm going to be.
I was just going to say, go ahead if you want to, but I can explain. We've also invited Larry to our curriculum council meeting tomorrow. We have weekly curriculum council meetings for our assistant superintendents of curriculum and instruction. So for those of you, we have many of those same folks on this distance learning, I almost called it a call, this Zoom today, but we will be seeing Larry again tomorrow.
Not for an hour and a half, though. They're going to get a much more condensed version.
30, 35 minutes.
So, everybody be well. Thank you so much for all you do for kids, and stay well and be healthy. Take care.
Thanks so much, Larry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Be well.
We'll be in touch with the PowerPoint and the recording of this webinar for all of you.
Okay. Thank you so much, everybody.
Take care, everyone.